What really killed Rome? Before we start, comment this right now. What destroys an empire first? Enemies at the gates or rot inside the walls? Because Rome did not die in one dramatic moment. It died slowly. It bled out over generations. And by the time the so-called barbarians delivered the final blow, the empire was already weak, exhausted, and full of cracks that had been spreading for centuries. Most people think Rome fell in 476 AD, when the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustus, was removed from power. But that was not the moment Rome truly died. That was the moment the body finally hit the floor. The real death started much earlier, and that is what makes Rome terrifying. Because if a civilization this rich, this disciplined, this feared, and this advanced could collapse, what exactly killed it? Was it invasion, corruption, bad leadership, economic decay, civil war, comfort, overexpansion, or was it something even worse? The truth is that Rome was not destroyed by a single enemy. Rome was weakened by a pattern of internal decay, short-term thinking, endless power struggles, and rising pressure from the outside that the empire could no longer absorb. At its height, Rome ruled tens of millions of people and stretched across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. The city itself was the first in the ancient world to reach around 1 million inhabitants. Rome looked eternal. Its roads, laws, armies, engineering, and political power made it feel less like a state and more like the natural order of the world. And that is always the most dangerous moment for any empire, when power stops feeling temporary. Because when people believe something is too big to fail, they stop asking the questions that could save it. Rome's problems did not begin with barbarians crashing through the gates. They began when the empire became too large, too expensive, too political, and too dependent on strong rulers it could no longer reliably produce. From 235 to 284 AD, Rome entered what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. In about 50 years, the empire went through more than 20 emperors. Think about that. More than 20 emperors in roughly half a century. That is not stability. That is a state in survival mode. Emperors were made by the army. Emperors were murdered by the army. Generals fought each other for the throne while enemies pressed the borders. Regions broke away. Loyalty became temporary. And once the prize of supreme power becomes more valuable than the survival of the system itself, collapse stops being a possibility and starts becoming a timer. Ask yourself this: if the men sworn to defend the empire are more interested in choosing the next ruler than protecting the frontier, how long can that empire last? Rome tried to solve the crisis. Emperors like Diocletian restructured the empire, split responsibilities, expanded bureaucracy, and tried to control a spiraling economy. On paper, it looked like reform. In reality, it was also an admission. The empire was becoming too difficult for one center to govern. Then came another symbolic shift. In 330 AD, Constantine dedicated Constantinople as a new imperial capital. That move made strategic sense. It was richer, easier to defend, and closer to major frontiers. But think about the message. When the emperor builds a new Rome somewhere else, what does that say about the old one? Rome was still sacred, but it was no longer the unquestioned center of power. And once a capital becomes more symbolic than strategic, the empire has already changed in ways its people may not fully understand. Meanwhile, the cost of holding the empire together kept rising. Armies had to be paid. Frontiers had to be guarded. Roads, grain, administration, and political loyalty all demanded money. Rome responded the way declining powers often do, by squeezing harder. Taxes became heavier. Coinage lost value through debasement. Inflation became serious enough that in 301 AD, Diocletian issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, trying to freeze wages and prices across the empire. Imagine the level of economic stress required for an emperor to threaten the market itself. And here is the real question. When a government starts fighting symptoms instead of causes, is it recovering or panicking? Because economic decline does not just empty treasuries. It poisons trust. Soldiers doubt their pay, citizens feel squeezed, elites protect themselves. The state asks for more while delivering less, and eventually, people stop sacrificing for an empire they no longer believe is working for them. Then the pressure from outside intensified. In 376 AD, large groups of Goths crossed the Danube seeking refuge from the Huns. Rome allowed them in, but Roman officials abused, exploited, and mishandled them so badly that the situation exploded into war. This is one of the most important details in the whole story. The Goths were not just a random wave of destruction. Rome turned a manageable crisis into a disaster through corruption and incompetence. 2 years later, in 378, came the Battle of Adrianople. And Adrianople was not just a defeat, it was a warning written in blood. The Roman Emperor Valens marched out without waiting for reinforcements. The result was catastrophic. Valens was killed, his army was shattered. Some accounts say the Romans lost upward of 40,000 men. 40,000. That is not just a battlefield loss. That is a psychological wound, a civilizational wound, because Rome's greatest myth was not that it never lost. Rome had lost before. Its greatest myth was that it could absorb losses, recover, reorganize, and return stronger. But what happens when even Rome starts struggling to replace what it loses? This is where many people get the story wrong. They imagine barbarians smashing a perfectly strong empire. But by the late 4th century, the empire was already increasingly dependent on barbarian troops, barbarian generals, and fragile political arrangements. The machine still looked Roman, but many of its internal parts were no longer what they had once been. And if your empire survives only by making emergency compromises, is that strength or delayed collapse? In 395 AD, after the death of Theodosius I, the empire was permanently divided between East and West. The East would survive for centuries as what we now call the Byzantine Empire. The West was not so lucky. Why? Because the East was richer, more urban, and better positioned to survive. The West was poorer, more exposed, and increasingly dependent on military strongmen to hold together a failing structure. Then came 410 AD. Alaric and the Visigoths sacked Rome. For the first time in nearly 800 years, the city of Rome fell to a foreign enemy. Pause on that. Think about how that must have felt to the Roman world, the eternal city, the city that had dominated the Mediterranean, the city that had taken the world, taken. Even though Rome was no longer the main administrative capital, the symbolism was devastating. This was not just a military event. It was a psychological collapse. When the myth of invincibility dies, the body often follows. And this is where I want your opinion. Do empires really fall when they lose territory, or when people stop believing in them? If you're still watching, comment with your answer now, because this is the heart of the whole video. After 410, the West kept staggering forward, but it was clearly wounded. The capital had already been moved to Ravenna because it was easier to defend. Think about that too. The rulers of the West were no longer ruling from Rome. They were hiding behind marshes. That is not confidence. That is a regime retreating into survival. Then the losses kept coming. North Africa, one of the West's richest and most important provinces, was lost to the Vandals. That mattered far more than people realize. Lose symbolism and morale suffers. Lose tax revenue and grain, and the system itself starts starving. In 455 AD, the Vandals sacked Rome again. By the mid-5th century, the population of the city had fallen to under 250,000, far below its old peak. Imagine what that means. Fewer people, less wealth, less confidence, fewer resources, more fear. The shell of empire was still standing, but the energy inside it was draining away. And that brings us to 476 AD, the date everyone remembers. Odoacer deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustus. It sounds dramatic, but by that point, the Western emperor had very little real military, financial, or political power left. The title remained. The substance had been hollowed out. So what really killed Rome? Not one invasion, not one emperor, not one economic crisis, not one moral failure. Rome died because its institutions became weaker than the pressures placed on them. It died because civil wars made unity impossible. Because corruption turned manageable problems into disasters. Because the economy could no longer carry the military burden. Because loyalty shifted from the state to ambitious men. Because reform came late and often treated symptoms instead of causes. Because the empire kept looking powerful after it had started becoming fragile. And maybe that is the darkest lesson of all. Great powers rarely look finished when they begin to fail. They still have monuments, they still have armies, they still have proud speeches, flags, rituals, and memories. From the outside, they can still look enormous. But inside, trust is weakening. Confidence is fading. People are fighting for position instead of purpose. And every new crisis hits a little harder than the last one. Rome was not killed in a day. It was exhausted over centuries. And by the time the barbarians arrived, they were not destroying an immortal empire. They were stepping into a grave that had already been dug. So maybe the better question is not, what killed Rome? Maybe the better question is, at what moment does a civilization become too hollow to save? And more importantly, would the people living inside it even notice in time? If you enjoyed this, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this channel is built for the stories behind the myths, the moments history stopped being distant and started feeling uncomfortably familiar. And before you go, tell me this in the comments. What killed Rome first? Political corruption, economic decline, military overreach, or the loss of belief in Rome itself? Because the scariest answer might be that it was all of them feeding each other until even Rome could not survive Rome.